we've got something special coming up. CommonWealth Beacon and Mass Inc. are celebrating 30 years, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. Join us on May 14th at the State Room in downtown Boston for an evening with readers, supporters, and leaders from across Massachusetts as we celebrate 3 decades of original independent journalism covering Massachusetts policy and civic life. We'll also be talking about the future with Ali Noorani of the Barr Foundation and Marty Barron, former editor of the Boston Globe and the Washington Post, both sharing their thoughts on how CommonWealth Beacon can help Massachusetts move forward. To learn more and grab your tickets, visit commonwealthbeacon.org/30th or click the link in the episode description. Hope to see you at the State Room on May 14th. Tickets are on sale now.
Massachusetts has been leaning into flexible voting options in the last few years, especially since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the 2024 state primary, more than 6 in 10 Massachusetts voters cast mail-in ballots. But a new executive order signed by President Trump on March 31st threatens to upend that system, directing the US Postal Service to deliver mail ballots only to voters on a federal citizenship list compiled by the Department of Homeland Security. So voting rights groups and more than 24 state attorneys general, including Massachusetts Attorney General Andrea Campbell, have rushed to court to stop it. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today I'm joined by Celia Canavan of the League of Women's Voters of Massachusetts and Davin Rosborough of the ACLU Voting Rights Project. Their organizations are bringing a federal lawsuit in the District of Massachusetts challenging the executive order, and that's one of at least 4 separate legal challenges filed since Trump signed it. So, today, welcome to you both.
Happy to be here.
Same here, thanks.
So, Davin, why don't we start with you kind of from the national level here? Walk me through a little bit what the March 31st executive order actually does. What would it change about how mail-in ballots work?
Yes. So what this would do at a very high level is sort of insert in a completely unprecedented way the federal government between states and voters. Different states have different mail voting policies. All of them allow some form of mail voting. It is something that is primarily regulated by the states. Congress has some powers related to it. The president has no powers related to it. And so what this does is say, on one hand, Department of Homeland Security create a list state by state of every citizen over the age of 18 years old. We can get into this. There's a lot of problems with that data. Number 2, it requires states in advance, well in advance of any election, to send a list of the voters who it believes are eligible voters who can vote by mail to the United States Postal Service. And it commands the US Postal Service not to process any mail ballots from anyone who is not on that list, and also implies anyone who is not on the Department of Homeland Security list as well. So it's an unprecedented interference, putting the U.S. Postal Service really in between voters and their ability to vote by mail in an unprecedented way.
So, Celia, when you saw this executive order come out, thinking about it kind of from the Massachusetts perspective, thinking about it from kind of a voter access perspective, what were sort of the first flags that were going off for you when you saw this?
Absolutely, yeah. As Davin said, the president has no power over this. And that was the first thing that really came to the league's attention, is that this is just another attempt to strip away the checks that we have on the president. Further than that, when we talk about voting access, in Massachusetts, vote by mail has been a huge resource, especially since we passed the Votes Act in 2022. Anywhere from 34% to 62% of voters vote by mail in Massachusetts. So we see this not only as, a huge issue in just, this is not how the Constitution wants us to run our elections. This is not how we've run our elections in our democracy. But this has the impact for majority of voters, for a potential for most of voters in Massachusetts to be affected.
And one of the things that sort of came to mind, as listeners of the podcast may be aware, I've lived in a few states. One that comes to mind is I went to high school in Utah, and that has a long tradition of mail-in voting, and it's a very red state, obviously. So after signing the order, the president said, quote, "The cheating on mail-in voting is legendary." He referred to this as the work of Democratic politicians and operatives. He himself has voted by mail from Florida before. So I guess, Davin, help me a little bit contextualize this in the history of what does mail-in voting actually mean and do for the outcomes of elections, and what doesn't it?
Absolutely. Mail-in voting, as you mentioned, has been a long-standing practice. Some states, like a number of the states in the West, do most of their voting by mail. Some states have it available to certain groups who particularly rely upon it, older voters, voters with disabilities, those sort of things. Basically, until 2020, mail-in voting was not seen as a particularly partisan issue. The best research wasn't really showing an advantage one way or another. It really was something that was done on a bipartisan basis in most places. It was really not until 2020 when President Trump, as a candidate, started attacking mail-in voting as corrupt, as fraudulent, trying to sow the seeds of distrust in any election results that then actually affected, in some places, who was using mail disproportionately, right? And also, undermining public confidence in it where it really hadn't been an issue before. It was really baseless. All the evidence shows that there's very little, the examples of any sort of fraud in mail voting is absolutely minute and not enough to affect election outcomes.
So, Celia, tell me a little bit about the coalition here. So you're one of a number of plaintiffs in this suit, which of course is being brought, as well by the ACLU, which is why you guys are both here. So walk me through how sort of your representative members are potentially going to be impacted by this, and kind of what the broader coalition might tell us about who could be affected by this change.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'll shout out, Davin, you're here. The ACLU has been a fantastic partner throughout this entire process, and we're more than thrilled to be working with them on this. But yeah, our larger kind of coalition that we have includes a variety of different either affinity organizations or voting rights organizations. We're proud to be joined as co-plaintiffs with the Association of American Residents Overseas, the US Vote Foundation, the Asian Pacific American Advocates Association, and Delta Sigma Theta Sorority. So a really wide range of people, because mail-in voting is not one thing or another. And my members, we have a lot of disabilities in our organization, seniors, and just straight up voters who don't have reliable access to transportation. If you live in Western Mass, you don't have public transportation the way we do out here in the East. So ending it would disenfranchise communities that already face barriers to voting. But it even goes beyond those physical abilities and what stops you from physically getting to the polls. If you juggle multiple jobs, mail-in voting provides the flexibility needed for those voters to participate in democracy without sacrificing a paycheck. So we know what it can cause to our members. We know that it would stop people with disabilities from voting. We know it would make it harder for seniors, but it is more than that. It's a working class problem. It's an everyday American problem.
Davin, this feels sort of related to what you had brought up earlier, which is, the order would have DHS basically compile a federal citizenship and only allow the Postal Service to deliver ballots to people on that. You alluded to the fact that there are sort of issues with the accuracy of pulling together that list, kind of, I assume, procedural problems with how that would actually be pulled together. So walk me through kind of, if this actually tried to be implemented, where would we see issues and how soon?
Right. So, well, on one hand, groups like the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts and our clients are already seeing issues because these are the organizations that provide education, voter engagement. And so they're already having to deal with this, and, their organizational missions are basically being put at risk here by this order. But when we're talking about, how this impacts specific voters, there's multiple problems here. First of all, the main system that the order contemplates relying upon is this SAVE system, which is run out of the Department of Homeland Security. And this traditionally was a system that was used to check eligibility for benefits. It has been transformed, and it's sort of a moving target right now, but with the introduction of Social Security Administration data. The problem with that is when we've seen states start to use that data, it undoubtedly pulls in people who are eligible U.S. citizens. Oftentimes, naturalized citizens are disproportionately targeted. Older people, the Social Security Administration data prior to 1981 did not reliably track citizenship. So there's just a lot of problem with the actual data itself. So it's going to undoubtedly, and already has when it's been used by states, cut out people who are perfectly eligible voters. In terms of the other lists, these state lists, right? Given the timelines at issue, there's all sorts of problems here. Some people don't know, right? Some people just don't know if they're going to vote by mail at that point. Some people live overseas, right? The uncertainty of this, that's some of our clients, but they're eligible voters in these different states. So the timing of this and the sort of putting USPS, which is supposed to be a neutral, non-discriminatory mail carrier, in charge of saying who can vote and who can't, just puts a lot of people at some really great risk, and particularly certain groups who will be disproportionately affected because of the inaccuracy of lists or because of timing issues.
And I think the last thing that I'd like to get to before we start kind of diving specifically into these legal claims here is, to your point, Davin and Celia, I wonder if you can talk to this, is, there is that timing question. There are several initiatives in Massachusetts, either, failed or successful or still in progress, to basically adjust how people can and can't interact with their voting process. We don't have election day registration, for instance. We do have mail-in voting. There are different reasons why knowing what your timing needs to be is so essential. So walk me through right now what it means that this could be rolled out now.
Yeah, I can say, for us, it's a concern that I can't honestly say I know for sure what it will mean for the everyday voter. And that is a huge part of the claims that, the league from Massachusetts has had, is that we aren't sure. And at the same time, it's great that you bring up election day registration. That's a fight we've been in for 20 years on Beacon Hill as that. And having to make that impossible decision of, do I sacrifice one voting right to protect another? Bandwidth is a real thing for this. Voters need to, pick an issue, not need to pick an issue, but have an issue they support. And there's already 12 questions on the ballot here, which is, or proposed to be on the ballot, which is record breaking for us here in Massachusetts. So I can't say, specifics. I'll look to Davin for maybe a little more clarity on that. But our biggest concern is that, if we, the voting rights advocates, can't say for certain what is going to happen to the everyday Massachusetts voter, how are they going to be able to know what they're going to have access to and when they're going to have access to it?
Davin, do you want to add something on that one?
Just a little bit. I agree with everything Celia said there. And it's a principle that actually the Supreme Court, even this Supreme Court, which has not been particularly favorable to voting rights, in our opinion, keeps emphasizing when voters are confused close to an election, one of the consequences of that is some of them are just going to stay home. Some of them are not going to vote. Others will think they have certain options, and the options will be closed off. So the uncertainty itself that this creates is a huge problem and can have a disenfranchising effect. And then just the timelines, for instance, the idea that states need to notify the USPS 90 days before the election, right? And then 60 days send a list. They can supposedly suggest alterations after that point. But, think about someone who moves to Massachusetts after, in between 30 and 60 days from the election, somebody who naturalizes, right, who becomes a U.S. citizen during that time, someone who plans on voting in person, but becomes experiences an illness or a disability that they didn't have before that changes their plans. So you can think of all sorts of different things that would basically put this right in between voters and their ability to reliably and predictably vote by mail that they, in a way they depend on.
And so this is the second of two executive orders in pretty, within a year of each other loosely, trying to impact the way that people can vote, impact the way that elections are managed on the federal level. Last year, there was a separate executive order adding kind of a documentary proof of citizenship requirement. That was ultimately blocked by federal courts. You folks sued over that one as well. So what did you learn from kind of the last attempt to wade into this, and how is this suit different?
So I think we learned a couple of things. One, unfortunately, this administration is willing to take unprecedented steps where others haven't before to interject the president, the executive, who has very little role in the voting process and none in terms of ballots, in to seize control over election processes. And two, that federal courts know, number one, that this is blatantly unconstitutional. The Constitution is really clear about the states having a big role in elections, Congress having a big role in elections. The president does not have that role in elections. So when the president tries to, by executive fiat, sort of seize that power and put mandates in place and say, I'm commanding this part of my administration to do this, that number one, it's unconstitutional. And number two, that it creates immediate harm. I mean, both in terms of groups like the League, who are so important and such a resource for voters in terms of engagement, in terms of education, in terms of registration, that it throws their efforts into disarray. It makes it impossible for them to plan and serve voters. And because of that, voters are missing out on some of those services. And ultimately, it harms voters. They don't get the access, the information. Some of them won't vote. Some of them will run into problems voting. I think that's really what we learned. But that in fighting back against this, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of resources to mobilize this quickly. I can say, I'm sure both on behalf of the lawyers and our wonderful clients, we have all had a lot of late nights recently, but that fighting back against this, it can make a difference. And like with the first executive order, we're really confident and hopeful that this one is going to be blocked.
So you're kind of tilting at a bunch of different potential angles on this one. And we should also note, of course, that this is one of, I think, 4 different suits all sort of challenging this one executive order right now as we're speaking, which is Friday the 24th. The Attorney General, Andrea Campbell here in Massachusetts, who is part of a broader coalition of state AGs, is asking the court to block implementation of this executive order. But so kind of diving into the case in front of us right now coming from this coalition, Celia, I wonder if you could start. One of the things that you're all taking aim at is that question of unconstitutionally burdening the right to vote. What does that sort of look like from your perspective?
Yeah, the core of that comes to who is directly impacted by this. This isn't all voters. This is not going to impact every single voter. I, as an able-bodied person who has a job that thankfully, the League does have voting time scheduled in. So even if I didn't vote by mail, I'm able to go vote on election day. I'm able to early vote. There is opportunities for me to go in person and do that. But there are so many people throughout the Commonwealth that don't have that opportunity. So when we think about this, it's not a voting law. It's an executive order. It is not constitutional in that way of the president does not have power over this. And where it disenfranchises some voters in the favor of swinging an election one way or another, that is where our concerns about constitutionality lie.
And Davin, I wonder, could you get into what to me is sort of like an interesting, maybe like wonky part of this, which is the USPS of it all? How does this end up dragging the Postal Service into this? Why is that a problem? How is that a line of legal attack?
Absolutely. So I would say there's 2 aspects of this. One is, yes, the bizarreness of the United States Postal Service being thrown into the middle of this. I think from a practical reason, because the president doesn't actually have any powers in this area, he's grasping at straws and trying to do anything he can from a purported executive, position to throw a wrench in the gears, basically. And USPS this time as his chosen instrument. The previous executive order was the Election Assistance Commission. So that's the sort of practical part. He doesn't actually have any tools at his disposal here, and so he's grasping. In terms of the legality, there's sort of two main parts here, particularly in terms of what we're pursuing. We filed our preliminary injunction motion last night. It's being heard together with the states on June 2nd in Boston. And there's sort of two main parts of that argument. Number one, the president doesn't have any power in this area. So, of course, he can't compel the United States Postal Service to block the transmission of mail ballots. But even in a world in which he had some power here, he can't compel the US Postal Service to violate federal law. And that's the other part of it. There are extensive federal laws that Congress passed with the whole idea that the United States Postal Service should neutrally deliver mail. It should not discriminate. And even when there's particular types of mail that Congress has wanted to regulate about, it's been very specific. And it doesn't allow the United States Postal Service to just hold up that mail on its own. There's a whole structure in place of a lot of laws here. And this basically asks the United States Postal Service to violate at least several of those laws in terms of being a neutral, non-discriminatory carrier of mail, not being able to choose based on the sender or the type of mail, whether or not this is going to go through, except for certain designated things, which even then it needs to go and get prior approval to sequester that mail. So it's both from a perspective of the president just doesn't have the power to do any of this, and the president also doesn't have the power, even if he had some power, to tell the United States Postal Service to violate a whole slew of federal laws.
And I'd like to kind of probe a little bit, and maybe Celia, you'd be the best person to speak to this, the kind of purported rationale for changes around mail-in voting is this idea that we've kind of prodded out a little bit of, fraud, irregularities, people not saying they are who they are. What does that look like from kind of a voter education and advocacy perspective? I'm sure people do have trouble sometimes with the mechanics of figuring out, how they go about voting. But to what level do you see either instances of deliberate or accidental errors on a pretty regular basis?
We really don't, at least here in Massachusetts and with the league's work. We are very grateful to have 44 local leagues. We're one of the largest state leagues in the nation, and we represent 51% of all voters. So that's a voting majority that is getting quality access to voter education. And at large, the league is not the only place you get voter ed, as much as we love to be the premier. But we know that Massachusetts just doesn't have a long or impactful history of voter fraud. We have a couple of cases, 4 total, according to the Heritage Foundation, and their election fraud work, but this isn't something we see, and a lot of our voters in Massachusetts are very diligent about what they're doing. A lot of the questions I do a decent amount of voter registration, but a lot of it is, what's my ballot look like? Do you know what my hybrid open meeting town law? We have very informed voters here in the Commonwealth, and it's both a blessing and also something that concerns us is, having these informed voters not know where to go next or not know what's happening and being punished simply for doing the right thing by going and voting, by going through all of the legal ways to register to vote by mail. That's our biggest concern, is knowing that this doesn't exist here in the Commonwealth. We don't see it widespread throughout the nation. election. And yet this continues to be a dog whistle that not only our executive administration is saying, but our president is, holding on to, especially with an election he lost 6 years ago.
And I think maybe we'll end it while staying on that state level here. As we've noted, this is kind of happening on parallel tracks right now. Davin, where are the states in this, essentially? What does that look like kind of in terms of the broader puzzle piece of all of these different lawsuits kind of coming together at the same time?
Sure. So there is a lawsuit filed by a number of the states in the same court before the same judge that we have, Judge Talwani, that's being led by Massachusetts, California, Washington, and Nevada, but includes other states. And, I think they point out similar problems, unconstitutional, illegal aspects of this executive order. They bring a bit of a different perspective, obviously being the states, but an important one, I think. There is now another group of states, I think 12, led by Missouri, that is seeking to try to get into this case, and the cases in DC as well, to try to argue that they want the executive order to stay in place because they want these restrictions. Basically, they want the United States Postal Service to serve as a barrier between their voters and their ballots, which is really puzzling to me, but that's what they're saying. And the court has not decided yet whether to let them into the case and on what basis.
Okay, great. So that's kind of the next thing that everyone's looking at before it's heard officially whether or not there's now this opportunity for this new group to also intervene.
That's exactly right.
Okay, great. All right. So that's sort of what we're looking forward on the procedural side. Celia, as this kind of gets sorted out, what is next from the league's perspective? What are you doing in the meantime?
Yeah, we're building that momentum. We have a lot of concerns that we've lined out through this claim, but make no mistake, the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts is here to stay. We're here to make sure that whatever your ballot looks like, you have access to it. We are prepared to, whether that means, pulling out our cars again and getting people to the polls the good old-fashioned way, or hopefully and thankfully getting people to vote by mail. We will continue to do our elections-based education work. We will continue to hold our candidates forums, and we'll continue to hold power accountable, whether it's here in the Commonwealth or across the nation.
All right, there's a lot to finish watching on this one. I don't expect it's going to be resolved in a brisk manner right now. But for now, thank you so much, Celia and Davin, for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Celia and Davin for joining me on the podcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is by Charlie Cazella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us, and email podcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back in your ears next week.